Okay, guys, here we go again. Now that we're back and we've looked at some of the basic skills of a biologist, it's time to start looking at the actual biology here. And first, though, it's going to seem kind of surprising. We actually have to start off with a little bit of chemistry. Don't be scared. Because actually we're going to start to look at, on the smallest scale, what living organisms are made up of. And as I said, we'll start really small. So to begin with, if you look at this phrase here in the beginning, organic macromolecules, wow, that seems nerdy. Well, we know from previous science classes what molecules are. We'll take a look at that in a second. Macro meaning large, and organic referring to carbon-based living chemistry, living life forms. So let's take a look at a quick basic review of that. Some of the major, really what we'll be looking at are the building blocks of life. What is life made up of? So to do that, we've got to go back and remember some of our previous, recall on our prior knowledge, some of the previous things we've learned, that everything, all matter, is made up of atoms of various elements, and that holds true with life. Now, one of the interesting things that we are going to see here is that those of you that have taken chemistry already will remember that, oh my gosh, it can be so confusing and difficult, but relax. We're really going to be spending our time primarily with only a few of these atoms. As we can see right here, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, way over here. Go with a little bit of hydrogen, and those will primarily be our major building blocks. Now there are others that'll be involved, but those are the big ones. And when we say the big ones, what we mean is that they are the major, absolute major building blocks of life. We can arrange them in any way that we need to build these molecules, which will in turn build life. And since we just had looked at some of the major molecules, we're going to focus on our most important here, the basic building block of all life, hence the name, the organic part of that, all living things. The most common element that you'll find in living things is carbon. And what's so special about it, what we're going to see, is that it can be the centerpiece, the hub of all these molecules that we're going to look at. We can stick anything to it, essentially, and it can form chemical bonds with just about any other atom in any arrangement. So down here, wow, what are all of these things? If you look, you're probably familiar with some of them. Methane, which methane gas. And if we look at it, there's carbon in the center. And these lines, every time we see these lines, they represent, those of you that have taken chemistry may remember, they're chemical bonds. So we can actually look at methane, this methane gas, in a couple of different ways. We can see it as in this structural diagram, or sometimes we'll see it written as CH4. And that CH4 is the same as this one. All we're saying is one carbon attached to 4 hydrogens. And we can actually see in here that there are numerous arrangements. They can form basic, carbon can end up forming small molecules, large molecules. They can be in straight chains. They can form rings. They can have 2 lines here means a double bond. So basically we can build whatever the heck we want with carbon. And that's going to be great because we can build any macromolecules that our cells need to. So really the simplest way to think of this is Legos. We've all played with Legos as kids, and remember, you have just a few basic colors and shapes of Legos. The 6 pug or 6 nubby blocks, the ones with 4, and they're pretty simple, but think of all the amazing things you can build with them. And just simply by arranging them any way that you choose, you could build rockets, cars, animals, houses, and the best part is that when you're done, you can disassemble them, rearrange them, and build something else out of the same pieces. And the molecules we're about to talk about, and carbon, and the atoms carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, we can do the same thing. Stick them together in various arrangements, and that will give us a wide array of molecules. And what we're saying here, the fancy term really is those Legos in science are called monomers. Mono meaning one, so each one of these is essentially a small building block, and if we bond them together, we can get polymers. Poly meaning several, many. And notice in this case we have a huge molecule here, a huge chain made up of individual building blocks. And the molecules we're going to be talking about here are essentially mono and polys. Simple, small building blocks and large molecules. So let's go ahead and look at there actually are 4 of them. We're going to focus on 3 here, and you probably are very, very familiar with most of them. Our first one, carbohydrates. Now, what comes to mind when you hear the term carbohydrates? Hydrate, what word does that look like? Hydration, dehydrated, kind of relates to references water. Carbo looks an awful lot like carbon. So what we're going to see here, sometimes you may hear these referred to as sugars. And then that's a simple, very, very simple term for them. But let's look at a couple of things here. We'll focus on what do they look like, what are they made up of, and what do they do for living things. So carbohydrates, if you think of them in context of sugars, what they might be used for, they're primarily energy, we'll see, but they are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the elements that we find in them. C's, H's, and O's, we'll look at some pictures in a moment, bonded together. And they're usually in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. Now what we mean there is 1 carbon, oops, sorry about that. What we mean is 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. So if we were to write out a formula of a basic sugar, we'll see one in a second. We'll look at it. Glucose is one. Its formula is C6H12O6, meaning they're 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. It has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. For our future reference. And the biggest use of them, but certainly not the only use, is energy. They're primarily used as energy in living organisms, and they can even be used in plants and in some organisms, some animals, for structural purposes. Body parts build up, made up of them as well. So let's start to look at what they are. We know their uses and basically what they're made up of. We've got a couple of different classes here. Saccharide refers to sugar. Mono means one. So the most basic types of carbs are simple single sugars, monosaccharides. And one thing that we want to really focus on is notice the "-ose" ending on the words there. Anytime we see "-ose," like ribose, glucose, there's our buddy glucose. Remember C6H12O6? If we counted them all up, start right here, 1 carbon, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. But it's a dead giveaway. Anytime you see "-ose," it's a sugar. And another interesting thing about carbohydrates is they almost always, when inside of cells and organisms, form rings. So anytime you see a ring-like structure, usually indicative of a carbohydrate as well. Now, we can take a couple of monosaccharides, 2 or 3 or 100, and stick them together, and we get polysaccharides. Remember, poly meaning many. So if we took, for example, 3 glucose, 1, 2, and 3, and we bond them, stick them together, up to thousands of them, we now have a polysaccharide. And it's not just one single sugar, it's many. So it's much bigger, and in turn what we'll see is that it actually has much more energy stored in that as well. So really quickly, some examples of polysaccharides you've probably heard of. Starch in foods. We'll look at what those are. Cellulose, there's that "-ose" ending. And another one that's very important, glycogen. So here we have an image of, food. And if you look at some of these things, potatoes, breads, fruits, grains, pastas, etc., they're very heavily laden in starch. There's a lot of carbohydrates in the form of starches, big molecules in them, and hence they do have a lot of stored energy, which our cells could then use. We eat these foods, our bodies break them down and disassemble the Legos and reassemble them in ways that we need them, whatever that may be. So again, a starch is just, here's glucose ring, stuck to a glucose ring, stuck to a glucose ring, stuck to, and keep going and going, hundreds of them. Pretty big molecules. Here's an image, actually, what we've kind of have seen in one of our other previous videos is a bunch of cells here. But if we look closely at, for example, this one cell here, we can see some dark shading right in here. Now that dark shading is actually a cluster or a packet or a pool of this substance, this glycogen, which is just another form of a large carbohydrate that can be stored in our cells. Now, ask yourself, why would your cells want to store glycogen? That's easy. We want to store energy just in case for when we need it for a rainy day. Very, very efficient, and this actually is from an image from liver cells, heavily laden in glycogen. So there's a lot of examples of these polysaccharides. And again, there's our glycogen. You can see it looks very, very similar to starch. Sugar ring, sugar ring, sugar ring. But instead of being a straight line, it ends up in this branched, twisted, spiraled pattern. But very similar. So again, what are the elements? C's, H's, and O's. What do they look like? How do you recognize them? And how are they used? That's what we want to focus on. So really quickly here, let's take a look at lipids now. So for lipids, we want to think of fats, oils, and waxes. Think fatty, greasy, and I'm sure you're familiar with these lipids. They're very large molecules made up mainly carbons and hydrogens, maybe an oxygen here and there, but mainly C's and H's. And they have a lot of uses, but primarily they can be used for energy storage. One big one for us we'll see later, your cell membranes, the outer covering of your cells, are made up of lipids primarily, and they can even act as chemical messengers, among other things. So a lot of different uses there. Now let's just look at two different classes. They can be saturated. Here is one. Notice that it's C's and H's primarily with a single bond all the way between them. Here are some saturated fats. Think animal fats. Saturated usually are the quote-unquote bad fats. They can also be unsaturated. Notice a little different in shape, and don't worry too much about whether it has double or single bonds. But again, long chains, C's and H's, with a few O's on the end. We can join a bunch of these together to get large lipids. And these are more of the healthier, quote-unquote, fats, fish oils, vegetable oils, etc. So again, they have some basic uses, and we'll look more at these. Think of the types of foods and how they would be used is our primary goal. And the last one, save this for last, we'll quickly look at it because we'll spend a lot of time with it, because I think they're the most important, proteins, aka proteins. Now, they're the most important because these are massive molecules, and instead of being made up of little sugars linked together, they're made up of something called amino acids, which are built of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and another element, nitrogen. And they're the most important because they have many jobs, like performing chemical reactions. Our next video is actually going to be devoted solely just to this aspect. A lot of structures in organisms' bodies, muscles, etc., are built up of hair, nails, built up of protein, and they even are responsible for moving substances in and out of our cells, sugars, waste products. So these are by far, all organic compounds are important. These are the most important. So again, really quickly, the amino acids, if we look at them, don't get too confused. Carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, but over here we can see a dead giveaway, nitrogen. So this is one amino acid group. This R is like a variable in algebra, can be anything, like an X. And all we do is take hundreds and hundreds of these and link them together until we get this large folded structure. Here's our protein. This might be an enzyme, it might be muscle, involved in muscle, etc., actin and myosin. But the shape is very, very important with proteins. Massively important. And again, as we said in our next video, before we wrap up here, we're going to look at ways that enzymes, here's our protein, can actually drive chemical reactions. Take two substances, grab onto them, join them together chemically, and spit out something different. So when you say you digest your food or you are growing and building muscle, this is what you're doing. So very, very important. And The fourth one, by the way, we're just going to touch on nucleic acids. This is our DNA, genetic information. We're going to hold off on this one until later, though. So enjoy.